Chapter 9 really centered on the Great War, World War I, for example, and how it had such impacts on British politics, of course, the economy, and its role, in Europe and around the world. But specifically talking about it moving more to a democratic state. Here now in Chapter 10, we're talking about the third British Empire, like the third phase of this British Empire, and what were kind of the hallmarks of it, economically, politically, etc. And where here we see now some other big things happening during this era, the Great Depression, that we also experienced, of course, here in the United States of the 1930s, before World War II, and then of course the other event, the Second World War itself, and how these events also helped propel Britain to be shaped as it was, and as they responded to these world pressures, as they were involved in the dynamics of these world events, and then recovering from them and so forth. These are all topics in this chapter, but with the overarching concept here is the third phase of a British Empire, and which is a phase of a social democracy. The dates associated with this third phase or third British Empire is 1931 to 1976. On page 354, just reading and quoting from the book, I thought this was a great summary and tying both of those two events into this overarching view of the discussion of this chapter. The first Great Depression punctured faith in the efficiency of free markets, the whole liberal political economy from the past, and the Great War. This was talking about World War I at that point, had accelerated the erosion of cheap government and laissez-faire, which we had talked about that as the British government, took back a lot of civil liberties and so forth, and became a lot more imperial in its actions to rally around the First World War I. But then it says this comment that he makes is, yet it was the second Great Depression of the 1930s, as opposed to the one from 1873. It was the second Great Depression and the final abandonment of free trade and the gold standard in 1931 that marked the decisive moment of transition to a new system of government and economic management. Again, ushering in really this phase of a social democracy. The first question even asked us to dive into recognizing the characteristics of the social democracy. What were those? And they're pretty straightforward as he lays them out very succinctly. It should have been pretty straightforward to respond to this question, as he just lined out those three main characteristics of the social democracy, with the first part of that being a state-managed economy that is dependent upon the British imperial structure, its British relationships with its dominions, its colonies, closely tied countries. So still kind of that imperial footprint in that sense, but it would be state managed, where the liberal political economy is advocating the state to leave the economy alone and just be a policeman for fairness. And then we saw that change in World War I, but then now again with the Second Great Depression and the Second World War, and even leading up to the Second World War, we see this state involved in this perspective where the state is going to manage the economy, and it's especially tied to that imperial structure that it's going to play on. It's going to involve approaches to colonies to try to keep them closely held if possible. It's going to play on using tariffs to do that as well. And then also the advent, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, other things like the sterling area, again, to bolster or even maybe insulate the British Empire from what was going on around the world economically. Also to note, in the state-managed economy that's dependent upon an imperial system, also would include nationalization of key industries. And that's a very socialistic move there. Socialism advocates for government ownership of a lot of things. Well, here, as a piece of this social democracy, the state is being seen to in need of nationalizing certain key industries. So the second aspect, hallmark characteristics of this social democracy, is a welfare state, meaning it's going to be including Social Security for all, health insurance for all, education for all, and so forth. And then the third aspect, kind of tied to the first one a little bit, is that further dependence on the imperial system as it invests in its colonies, with this dual mandate concept of trying to say that, hey, we're going to bring good things to you, and we're going to try to lift you up, in an effort to try to hold kind of its empire together, so to speak. Those would be the three main ingredients to the characteristics of this social democratic approach, both in the homeland and around its empire. So make sure to take note of those. Again, they were very succinctly brought up. It's through this era, though, that we will see eventually how the liberal political economy had risen, but then it falls away, moving away for this social democratic era. But then we'll see again, as this very short-lived era of the social democracy, it actually makes way again for the reinvention of a liberal political economy kind of structure, so forth. So it's kind of interesting that way. But so I just thought that paragraph succinctly kind of paints that picture on page 354 of the things that we're looking at, and basically making a decisive moment in 1931 for at the beginning of this social democratic era, this new government system, very much different than a liberal political economy, but yet still imperial. So in a sense, it's still a new imperial advent, even though it has some democratic overtones. We see, and I've included some links here in Populi. I hope you guys will enjoy going to these links and just kind of get a flair for what life was like at the homeland, both in the industrial working setting and how rough their living environments were, outtakes about just the poor itself, hunger marches and strikes and so forth. I just put these links there for you to go to kind of just sit back and just kind of enjoy some of the taste and the feel of that era. And especially since some of these are documentaries produced in that era, especially in the 1930s. And centered, again, we mentioned it in the last video, in the last chapter, about hunger marches. And this hunger march continues to be a new a mechanism that, again, is spreading worldwide. And we see this happening quite a bit. And one of the first links that I provided for you deals with that. And I'm interested to see what you guys think of that, and some of your thoughts or any discussion, as this document is dealing with the general strike of 1926, and even shows hunger marches in there too. But it's interesting. I think after you see this, you'll see that the people speaking in this documentary, and especially then towards the end, the woman's voice. You'll see their slant on this. And as they're looking at these masses and these less than civilized and so forth, there's kind of a bit of a propaganda, calling these people selfish, and that, why so much unrest and why so much unhappiness, almost and in a mockery of it, in a sense, and associating it with the Red Army. So again, that's related to the fear of the spread of communism and Russian communism, therefore the Red Army, and even links in this documentary, especially this latest comment, wrote just kind of briefly, that links these mass demonstrations of strikes and hunger marches, etc., with selfish people and being influenced by socialism or communism. And so I thought it was interesting because this document came out of that era. Again, this era often referred to in the 30s as the Hungary 30s, with all these marches associated with it, and that they had hoped, these marches had hoped that it would wake up the affluent British classes, and even if it's middle classes, it's that there's a whole other world going on here that you guys aren't aware of. They're starting to see in some of the wealthier areas and even the middle class areas, more people having cars, individual houses, really nice with space and clean, plenty of food, and so forth. Real education, the kids coming home and working on their homework, and almost this kind of civilized society, in this British culture. But at the same time, we see there's much different scenery in most of the British Empire, even in the homeland itself. Also, then you'll see some documentaries that, as you and I apologize in some ways because they have very strong British accents. Some of these that are interviewed in the living conditions of the industrial areas or in the conversations from the poor, it can be very tough to hear them a bit because their accents are very strong. But if you kind of slow it down, maybe take pieces of it at a time, you'll hear some of the key things that are mentioned about their living conditions, like what's it like, how they have to cook and how they have to get water, or the condition of their buildings, and how many times one of the ladies keeps talking about all the shoring up, that it's confined and tight enough and bad enough. Things are kind of falling apart. Stairs are not even, so forth. But now even the space they did have to walk is even hampered by the shoring up, which is, more posts, kind of being in place in the middle of a room where it shouldn't have to be, so to speak. And so I hope you find those interesting, and looking forward to you guys even interacting about them if you like. Also, I did put one comic relief in there, having fun with or poking fun at this new industrial area, this new industrial revolution. A famous actor from the time, Charlie Chaplin, has a movie called Modern Times, and it's a fun clip in there too, where you just see this individual just involved in an industrial working factory situation, and almost like it causes him to go crazy, so to speak. I think you'll enjoy that. And Charlie Chaplin, he had been a boy, as I mentioned, just in a traveling group of dancers before the advent of the movie industry and some of the film stuff that he was able to get into later, and he became such a famous comedian even in the silent films. So I hope you enjoy that. The Great Depression of the 1930s, again, it just proved once again that there can't be a reliance on free trade in the open markets to actually distribute wealth. One more time, there's always a great divide between those who have and those who have not. We see that in imperialism, and now basically the result of even the open trade, open market system really kind of doesn't offer too much difference, is a sentiment that somebody could take away from this, especially then when you have this Great Depression, another great collapse that the entire world feels. So this free trade system has failed, and then makes a way for something else to be tried. Also then, as mentioned in the previous lecture, and again talked about in this chapter, is this growing concern of communism and fascism, and mixed with more and more scientific approaches to managing government, ties also into this social democratic process. The motives of stemming other ideologies from a political or government standpoint, mixed with more and more scientists being involved in the managing of government compared to just legislators or elite classes or the ruling classes. It's now turning more and more over to a scientific process. One of the advents of this era is PEP, P-E-P, the Political and Economic Planning group that was formed even in the beginning of the war, to help plan and even pre-plan post-war British structure and society. Even produced journals called Planning. And again, it represents a scientific approach, that there was a belief that maybe other than politicians, scientists could actually do a better job at discovering the problems and coming up with correct and more appropriate solutions, as we see other things from other eras have not been working. But their scientific findings and approaches, however, was to be backed by the government to get behind any initiatives that came out of those processes. Let's talk a little bit now about World War II. Why did it start, or especially why did Great Britain jump in? And the answer to that is really simple, as the author even points out. Great Britain jumped into World War II for the exact same reason it had jumped into World War I. And that was, again, coming out of a desire to be neutral, and in reaction and responding to what they were seeing Germany do. And again, the Second World War II era, with Germany and Hitler, rolling into Poland and just forcefully taking over areas. Even Austria wasn't a military takeover, but it happened because of a threat that it could have been, and so forth. But England then jumps into World War II just out of concern, out of Germany's aggressive moves, really. And then, of course, came with that, war with Japan, as Japan and Germany were allies, and then so was Italy, allied with with Germany as well. And those allies on that side of the line we know as the Axis. In World War I, it was Central Powers, Germany and the Ottoman Empire, versus the Allies. In World War II, we have the Axis powers against the Allies. Axis powers, again, here, Germany, Italy, Japan, to note, and then Allies, France and Great Britain, Russia, and then eventually the United States as well, coming onto the scene just a little bit. And keep in mind, World War II had been going on for a couple years before the United States became involved, and it became involved because of Japan bombing Pearl Harbor in 1941. Up to that point, the United States was lending funds and resources to Great Britain, for example, and even, benefiting from the sale and exports of goods, related to the war effort and so forth. But definitely came in at the attack of Pearl Harbor. And once it declared war on Japan, then of course we were at war with Germany as well, because of the Allied alliances and so forth. Great Britain, though, and especially throughout the war, but especially those first couple of years, it kind of reminds me in the Bible of an image of the cedars of Lebanon, standing alone against all the winds and so forth. Well, Great Britain for a couple of years was taking on all the heat as it was being bombarded by Germany. And that goes right into our second question. In what ways, now let me just read how the question was read specifically. Where did I have that? Where do I say? Oh, why did the Second World War become known as the People's War in Britain? And how accurate was that description? I would offer up to you guys that is a very accurate description, called the People's War, and when it pertains to Britain. Imagine a bit of a difference. As catastrophic and huge World War I was, it was still very much a war that was fought somewhere else. Even the Western Front in France was not too far off, but it still was not on the homeland of Great Britain. Where here, you're being bombarded by aircraft and bombs from Germany in London, with sirens going off and blackouts happening to try to make everything dark so the German airplanes can see their targets. So one of the couple of things I would mention on why I believe for sure the answer would be that this is a people's war. From Great Britain's standpoint, is the people were involved very intimately at all levels, both military and civilian. In the homeland now, it was also the front line for Great Britain. And like the book says, the lines were blurred between civilian and military targets, where in other typical warfare situations in the past, there was a little bit of chivalry involved, where you don't just wipe out civilians, especially women and children, so to speak, when you let the fighting men fight the battles. Well, that was not a situation here at all, as bombs did not have discrimination on who they would take out and what they would take out, churches to military targets, military personnel, and civilians, all the same. And so that was one huge reason why it had been a people's war. Second was the way that the British society kind of collectively took on responsibility. Some of my favorite examples would have included, the 3 million children from London being moved to other parts of the country, and especially to the north, and very often being taken in by strangers, British, but strangers. But as this collective responsibility in coping with, dealing with the onslaught of World War II and all the bombing and warfare that was going on in the homeland itself. If you guys, I'm sure most of you, not all of you, have seen Narnia. And it starts off with this. Watch the early clip. I probably should have included that one. But watch an early clip of the beginning of the movie Narnia. And you see the bombing going on. You see them running to a shelter, trying to get to a shelter. And then you also then see the children leaving on the train, heading to the north. And then eventually that's where they find the cupboard, or whatever that thing's called, probably a closet type thing, and discovering Narnia and so forth. But it's fun to watch that, especially in the context after reading this book and this material. It gives you kind of a more appreciation for elements of movies like that as well. I digress a little bit. I got a little sidetracked with Narnia. But anyway, other things that we see related to this being a people's war is even the Ministry of Information, and how it was trying to maintain and increase the morale, now not just of troops, not trying to keep the troops motivated to fight and have a hope that they can win, but now it's concerned about morale of the entire society. And it's producing films and documentaries and propaganda. I think in this sense that would be a positive use of the word, where they're trying to bolster the morale of a society. Even like the book talks about, celebrating extraordinary deeds done by ordinary British citizens as just another way of rallying the excitement and the hope of, as a nation is at war, big time, and being directly impacted by war on their homeland. These things also would include the Ministry of Information, but also been including vision already of beyond the war, what it's going to look like, and plans for beyond the war initiatives as well. And this is very important. They not only deal with getting through the war and trying to become victorious in the war, but also staving off any other ideologies coming in, socialism, Bolshevism, etc. So looking forward to seeing your guys' answer to that as well. Enjoy these documentaries. I think you will. They comprise a decent little amount of time, maybe 30-40 minutes if you watch all of them together, completely. But I think you will enjoy those. And it's an interesting era to study here, because we aren't that far removed as we have come this close to these years, 1931 through 1976. We obviously are that much closer to the specific dates that we live in. You can see more and more of the interactions and the ongoings of these times, and how we still see effects of them, or how we use terminology from these eras, and we see structures and alliances that are still in place today, or definitely are as a result of this era as well. So enjoy, and I look forward to seeing the discussion from you guys on Chapter 10.